Mom, Dad, there's no way that I can express to you what I'm feeling right now. My heart is full to bursting, except to say, I'm the king of the world!
Hello and welcome back to Cameron, King of the World. And finally, in this series, we get to the point in which Cameron begins his journey to becoming the King of the World with the 1997 film Titanic. But it took a long time to get there. And in this video, we're going to talk about how James Cameron raised the Titanic, so to speak, and the journey that led him from his previous film True Lies to making, producing, and releasing the 1997 epic Titanic. Now, in the next video, I'll talk about my thoughts on the film, which will be, I'll leave actually that stuff until then, because I've already talked about the film in a video that's yet to be released, and it's a very lengthy, like hour-long video, so I feel like I'm going to be repeating myself in this video and in the next one, but it just kind of is what it is. I couldn't do a James Cameron series and then not talk about Titanic, and especially considering the fact that this is the reason that Cameron, King of the World, came to be. The reason I got way back into James Cameron's films was revisiting Titanic, which I'll talk about more in the next video. But for now, Cameron had done True Lies, and it was, we talked about, Spider-Man, and there were lots of different projects percolating and might have happened, might not have happened. He did Terminator 2 3D, but that was more of an attraction and an experiment in 3D, I think, than a bona fide film project for Cameron. It was kind of a hybrid. But in 1995 was when Cameron started considering making a film on Titanic. He'd always been fascinated with shipwrecks and had fancied himself, maybe one day being a deep sea explorer. But, he'd kind of made his bed. He'd become a director, and that was his career choice, and that was the path that he went down. But he started to think about it again, and now under the guise of going down to the wreck of the Titanic and actually filming it with movie cameras. And so he pitched this to Fox, who he was working with and had a contract with for multiple movies, which began with True Lies, and there was an agreement there to go down and film some footage of the shipwreck of Titanic, and he actually took a crew down there 12 times, 12 separate dives, to get footage from the ship, and it wasn't the most smoothest of operations. There were a number of controversial moments. Some of the submersibles they used actually knocked into the Titanic. A bit of a propeller came off and shattered. I think the captain's room got caved in a little bit, and even some of the grand staircase in the Titanic itself was damaged. So it wasn't all smooth sailing. No pun really intended. I suppose it's kind of intended. But after 12 dives, they filmed a lot of stuff and got the footage. And this is where Cameron really started to look at the possibility of crafting this footage into a film that would truly tell the story of Titanic. But I think he also knew that in order for this to really work as a big motion picture, you need something to draw that audience in. A dry, stale, sterile Titanic documentary is not really going to bring in the big bucks. If you want to spend a lot of money making a film of this scope and size and recreating the ship and really taking the audience back into the world of 1912, you need a lot of money to do that, to do it like convincingly and to a real high standard. And I think Cameron realized that for that to happen, he would need to have a love story take place in his version of retelling the tale of Titanic. And I think he said something to the effect of Titanic, that the story of the ship and the sinking was like a great novel, but a great novel that really happened. And so his mind was working. He did like 6 months of deep research on the ship, or more specifically the voyage of the ship that took place over, I think, 3 or 4 days, as it was going from Southampton to New York. And obviously sank in the Atlantic, and so he spent 6 months doing a deep dive and looking at people's recollections and all of the details and the history, and a detailed timeline of everything that happened, the night that the ship sank. So he really used all of that and even consulted historians, and he started writing his script, and he pitched to Fox that Titanic would be Romeo and Juliet on that ship. And it's funny because, initially when he was doing interviews and things, he talked about how, Fox were very dubious about this. This is a big epic movie. It's going to cost a lot of money. They were unsure. But because of their contract with him, their deal with Cameron, and their hopes to continue working with him, he'd really brought in a lot of money with True Lies. That was a very successful film. Terminator 2, also, he had a track record. And so they went along with it, and he went and filmed all of the stuff at the actual shipwreck, and got that incredible footage that you see in the film, which is very much a mix of real life footage and model work, and a lot of different techniques to make that very seamless. And I have to say, it does come off very seamlessly. At no point do I kind of register with my eye in that opening sequence in the shipwreck, oh, that's a model shot, oh, well, that's not really the ship. It really is expertly blended together, and the fact that some of that stuff is real footage really just adds to the weight of the story and the execution of bringing that ship back, in a sense, with visual effects and practical effects, but seeing the real ship in the real movie, it just adds that texture to it that it just gives it more weight, and so Fox were like, okay, we'll kind of humor you on this one a little bit. I mean, that's just conjecture, but it seemed like they weren't all guns are blazing, ready to go full, push all the chips into the middle of the table on Titanic or anything. But in later interviews, like 10, 20 years later, Cameron's fond of saying, well, I told them Romeo and Juliet on that ship, and they were like, we got it, like that's perfect. So I really do think, and this isn't the first time, and probably won't be the last, that Cameron's recollections of things, I'm not quite sure which one to believe. But I tend to lean more towards Fox being like, well, we don't know. This is a very big project. Not least of all, the name of the fucking thing is Titanic. Like, it's gargantuan as far as the weight of the real story. And, and it's this disaster and this tragedy that happened within punching distance of our generations. I think we all, even now today, how long has it been since the film came out? I have to kind of do my math now because time seems to slip away from me. We're almost 25 years out from Titanic coming out. But, we all have, great-grandparents and if not their parents who were around during that time. And so, it feels tangible enough that Titanic is still a big deal to a lot of people. And there are, great-grandchildren of survivors and so on who are around. And we'll talk more about that in a future video, actually. There's an interesting 20 years later documentary that was released recently where Cameron actually apologized to some of the ancestors of, ancestors technically is the right word, but, the descendants of people who had died or survived the Titanic, and he kind of apologized to them for certain things he did with the film, even though he was very much dedicated to, keeping things as true to the true story that he could, but also at the same time by using artistic license to make it a good movie, which I think is really why Titanic has stood the test of time for the people who do enjoy it. And for me, I love the film, and I do think it has really held up well over the years. But so Fox were, they weren't quite sure, but they gave him the okay, and he went ahead. He started writing the screenplay, and the idea of taking this romance, these two characters, and putting them together, and then framing the disaster around that so that you're involved on a human emotional level beyond just the tragedy of all the lives that were lost, which is still palpable in the film, I think, in the finished product. And then he also came up with the wraparound sequence of setting modern day sequences at the beginning and end of the film, and interspersed throughout the entirety of the film's running time to hook you in even deeper to a more immediate human, connection. So there's lots of layers of connections there to the lives that are really lost, to these fictional characters who you grow to hopefully love and kind of root for as a kind of fated, star-crossed lovers romance, doomed, romance, I guess you could say. So that was kind of the the gist. And the production designer Peter Lamont, he had to design so much for this film in terms of everything that was on the ship, because you couldn't find stuff from back then because it was under the ocean. So, and when the film is set is Titanic's maiden voyage, so everything on that ship would be pristine and perfect. And so I guess it created kind of a new challenge, perhaps with some period pieces. You could find things that are still around and kind of not age them, but kind of bring them back to where they would be at a certain point in time that you're making a film. With Titanic, you had to have it, pretty much bang on. And there was a lot of research, and obviously when they first found the shipwreck of the Titanic, I believe in the 80s, I think, maybe the 70s. It was a long time before they found the shipwreck of the Titanic. Once they did, slowly but surely things started to be collected and catalogued, and you could find little things and, just little artifacts that could inform, people who, generations beyond the events of the Titanic, what things looked like on the ship. And they also got hold of the blueprints of the ship, and they built a true to scale Titanic. Fox kind of hired, I guess, this 40-acre stretch of land on the kind of the shoreline of the ocean in Mexico, and that's where they built the ship inside a tank. So it wasn't built into the ocean, but it was built inside a huge tank that was then facing out to the ocean, so that when you film scenes on the deck, you could actually, have a legitimate, tangible ocean view behind them, and it would actually kind of work. And Cameron used a few techniques with the camera so that you couldn't really tell, unless you were really looking, that the water isn't quite moving like a ship would move through water. But by subtle camera movements and the way that he frames it, it really works. And I think that's a really neat kind of in a film that was pioneering a lot of digital technology. But specifically, I would say digital doubles, like the stuff where you have like big shots of the ship. Like there's one ship that was called the $1 million shot, where because it costs over $1 million. It starts, I think, at the front of the ship, and it pans up and back across the whole ship, and then shows you the ship going off into the horizon. And the whole thing is digital, but you have people walking around on the ship, and they're CGI people. And that stuff was really, pretty new technology at the time in 1996, 1997. It's one thing to do the kind of the liquid metal man in Terminator 2, where it's this kind of textureless, kind of just reflective surface, but to do an actual human, obviously it's, with that panning shot of the ship, they're very small kind of people. And I was looking for that when I rewatched the film. It was like, okay, is this going to hold up on a 65-inch TV, 25 years later? And it does. Like, I mean, you can tell that it's not a real person, but it's pretty damn good for its time. And so, in a film, again, with all this stuff where they're really pushing the digital technology and green screen and backgrounds and things, and I mean, that stuff, blue screen backgrounds, I mean, that's by the time Titanic was made, it was almost old technology, but, they were really at the cutting edge with a lot of visual effects in this film, and it was a very nice blend, I think, of practical effects, miniatures, and this huge ship. And, but, again, it's nice when there's just like a real kind of, almost a film school kind of thing, where it's just like, well, let's just move the camera a little bit and it'll look fine, so it's just this like kind of a simple fix to a problem where, you have the real ocean behind the ship, and you can kind of get the camera to almost simulate the way that the water is moving, and the naked eye doesn't really pay attention to it, because hopefully you're looking at the characters on the ship and not kind of inspecting the background. But subconsciously, peripherally, you get the sense that we're really seeing a real ship with the real ocean, because we kind of are. It isn't really a real functioning ship, but the illusion works, I think, and most of film is, at the end of the day, an illusion. So this huge ship was built in Mexico, and it was to scale. I think that they cut a little bit out of the middle, so it wasn't quite as the exact length, but scale-wise, it was bang on. The lifeboats and the funnels were shrunk by 10% for some reason. I forget the reason why. But for all intents and purposes, it was the Titanic. Some people say they only built half of the ship, so the other side of it, there was nothing there. Not technically true, because they have the, I'm trying to remember which side of the ship it was that was actually built, because there was an issue when they filmed the Southampton scene, because they built one side of the ship. I think it was the starboard side. The starboard side of the ship was built, The port side wasn't. I think it's something to do with the smoke coming out of the funnel, where, you know, when the ship was on its way to New York, I think. Either way, they only built one side of the ship. But when it came to filming Southampton, they realized that the ship was actually docked in Southampton on the port side. So what they had to do when they filmed that incredible sequence at the Southampton port is they had to film everything in reverse. Not in reverse, but mirrored. So the image was flopped, as they say. I would say flipped, but it seems the correct industry vernacular is flopped. So like if you would see like the White Star Line logo on the actual set, it would be backwards. So that when the camera films it, they flop the image in the edit and it reads beautifully in proper, English. But then they would have to go to the point where people walking in certain directions, they'd have to do it the other way around. Kate Winslet's hair would have to be kind of put, the other side, like the partings would have to be put on men's hair in the opposite direction for those sequences. So it was a very again, kind of lo-fi solution to a very big problem. But they did only build one side of the ship, but they did build the whole deck. So, it's really just the one side of the actual ship that's missing, which is fair enough. I mean, you don't really need. Obviously, they built everything that they needed, and it worked out all right in the end. So Cameron wrote the screenplay in 1995, I would assume, running into 1996, and then in July of 1996, production began on Titanic, and it was it was a highly budgeted film. I think $120 million was the initial estimate from Cameron, that that's how much this film is going to cost. And okay, so they go ahead in July of 96 and they filmed the present day sequences out in the sea, and they filmed that in Nova Scotia, Canada, and then they moved, I think a couple of months later in September of 96, to the Mexico set to film all of those sequences. And I'm not entirely sure where they filmed stuff on actual sets, like the interiors. I would assume in Mexico for maybe kind of ease of having everyone in the same kind of general area, but I didn't actually look that up, I have to say. But the ship itself was in Mexico, and this was a bit of a troubled production in some senses. You had crew members who weren't the most fond of Cameron as a director, including the cast. Kate Winslet said that he had a temper like you wouldn't believe, and there were times where she was quote unquote genuinely frightened of James Cameron. He would bark orders, he'd be very authoritative with the crew. And I think a quote from Cameron is filmmaking is war. And there's many different approaches, and I don't know if I've talked about this before in the series because I'm filming this all out of sequence, but it isn't a new thing when we get to Titanic. It's not suddenly this big revelation that Cameron is not the easiest man in the world to work with. He knows what he wants, and he feels like he can do every job himself. And as they say, as far as we're aware, the only job he can't do is act. So he still needs the actors, but Cameron would be like, no, that's exactly how I don't want it, and he would get in there and fix it himself, but then he'd feel annoyed that he would have to do that. And so, and it's a lot of pressure, I would imagine, to have the weight of $120 million on your shoulders, and, thousands of crew members, and you got the cast and producers and studio, and there's just so much. I mean, it was a huge film. I mean, the kind of scale of Titanic certainly hadn't been around for a while. I can't think of a comparable epic that had been made in the 90s to that degree. We're talking going back to like the true Hollywood epics. I mean, even beginning with and it maybe even before that, but I'm thinking the earliest example I can think of is Intolerance in 1916, I believe. 1919? I don't know. I can't remember when Intolerance came out. No, I think 1919 was when D.W. Griffith split that film into two pieces. So I think it's 1916, Intolerance, with the outrageously massive and expensive sets. But then to, the biblical epics like Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments and Spartacus, these big, long 3-4 hour long Hollywood epics, they'd kind of died out a bit, maybe for good reason, but this was like a return to form for that. And it's just a lot of pressure, I would imagine. But even then, you take a lot of pressure and then you add that to Cameron's already, highly focused mentality and directing style. And so, it was tricky for some people. And actually, when they were in Nova Scotia in Canada at the beginning of the shoot, so I'm assuming that he was already getting people's backs up they were at catering, and someone poisoned the food with PCP. That person was never found, and I think over 50 people were actually sent to hospital, hallucinating things, being sick, vomiting. And, you had, fairly, there was Gloria Stewart who was there to film her parts as the elderly Rose, and, luckily she didn't get poisoned, apparently, but, I mean, it's crazy. That's one of those things that you almost think, really, that actually happened? And apparently Cameron, I don't know whether this was, kind of a move on his part to quickly, it also reminds me of Gus in Breaking Bad, spoilers, go into too much detail, but apparently Cameron managed to vomit before the full effects of the PCP took over. So I don't know if he was aware that suddenly this was an issue and he needed to make himself sick to kind of get a lot of it up. But apparently, like, his eye was, one of his eyes was completely red, like a Terminator eye, according to Louis Abernathy, who plays the guy who is on the ship at the beginning and is showing the old Rose, the computer simulation, the guy with the beard and the long hair. And he said that Cameron's eye went completely red, not just the iris or the pupil, the whole thing was red. So the PCP thing, that was, I mean, you could look at it as kind of a prank, it's just going to make people see funny things, but at the same time, made a lot of people sick, a lot of people went to the hospital, so it kind of makes you think. And, again, Kate Winslet was, very vocal in the fact that she said later that, I'm not going to work with him again, unless it's for for a lot of money. And hey, here we are now in 2021, and she has worked with Cameron again on Avatar 2. So clearly, time heals all wounds, or maybe just the bottom line and the bottom dollar heals all wounds. I don't know whether it was a case of that, but I would say that, Kate Winslet was very young when she made that film, and it was obviously a very difficult shoot, and she's one of the main characters. She's in it a lot of grueling stuff in water, and, apparently from what I remember from the behind the scenes stuff, like some of the sequences with water, the water was heated, some of it wasn't heated. In fact, there was many crew members who got colds and flus and even kidney infections working out of water for long periods of time. But, Cameron was down in that water too, and he was often holding the camera himself and getting stuck in there and stuff. Probably because he wasn't happy with the cameraman. I don't know, that's just pure conjecture, but I can imagine him just wrestling the fucking camera off this guy's shoulder and be like, I'll fucking do it, give me a wetsuit, And even with some of the acting, Cameron was a little bit disappointed with what he was getting. In particular, there's a story about Bernard Hill, who played the captain of the ship, and how Cameron was not impressed with his performance on set. He thought he's not doing enough, he's not acting enough, and he was getting frustrated by this. And then he saw the dailies, in particular like the close-up shots, and realized what Bernard Hill was actually doing, and that there was so much behind the eyes of his performance and conveying this despair and hopelessness of this character, this man who was on his last job, his last voyage on a ship, and it was doomed, and he just completely shut down. And there's so much of that behind the eyes, and it's a brilliant performance. But initially Cameron was not too happy with that, but obviously he kind of saw the light once he kind of actually really looked closely, and perhaps maybe that was an issue where he wasn't looking as closely as he should have, or at face value he was judging things before giving them full credit. But a lot of tension, I think, on the set and the making of this film, and perhaps understandably. But so it was tricky. There was a few injuries as well when they're filming the stuff where the ship goes into a kind of an incline. Was that how you'd say it? When the ship raises up and it's at an angle at a certain degree, and people are falling down, and they would put the stunt people on skateboards actually, so it looks like they're falling faster than they are, and they would tilt the camera so it would give it even more of an extreme angle. But even still, people weren't getting hurt by hitting the kind of the sections of the ship on the way down, like the bollards and stuff, if that's even what you call them, but like the things sticking out on the ship, and people are hitting them and flying off them. Those were made out of rubber for those sequences specifically, but it was when the stunt people would fall onto each other that ribs are starting to break and stuff. So they leaned more towards digital doubles for a lot of that stuff after those incidents started occurring. The first scene shot between Jack and Rose, Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, was the nude scene where she's drawn by Jack, and And Cameron said that wasn't by design, it was just the scheduling. They were still waiting for the ship to be finished and stuff like that. And but he liked the way that it worked out because there was this kind of nervous energy between them that he thought was really fitting for that scene. So ultimately, the casting, I think, really worked out, and you had Kate Winslet, who was kind of a rising star at the time. Leonardo DiCaprio was a rising star at the time. It was kind of the perfect storm of these two very young, very talented, very attractive actors who are now working alongside each other in this romantic, sweeping epic. And they actually worked with Cameron on tweaking the script a little bit. They felt like the relationship between Jack and Rose was a little bit too neat and clean, and the through line was very much just a steady romance. And they wanted just a little bit of, of contesting between the two and a little bit of tension. There's not much in the film, but there was that scene on the deck where, he's winding her up and stuff, and she's getting annoyed with him and like, fine, forget it. So just it feels more natural that way, I think. And so, he was open to that. You might think of Cameron as this kind of dictator who lays down the law, and he, his word is the final thing, and he knows best. But there were certain things where he would, take input from actors and say, yeah, let's do that. The line where DiCaprio says, I think to Molly Brown, I think Molly Brown and also Rose's mother, I think he says, I'm going to go row with the rest of the slaves, and apparently Cameron's original line was something like, I'm going to go before I turn into a pumpkin, and Leonardo DiCaprio was like, how about I just say I'm going to go row with the rest of the slaves, a bit of dark humor. Cameron's like, yeah, let's do that, and he did it, and it's in the film. So he was open to collaboration, at least in small, in small parcels of kind of changes and suggestions, I suppose, and not whole cloth kind of scene changes, but he was open to it. And I think that's an important thing that maybe people wouldn't know or would even expect from Cameron. So yeah, and the film shoot was 138 days. That was the plan for the actual shooting schedule, and that ballooned into 160 days, which isn't the worst. I mean, that is almost another month when you think of it, as 22 extra days. But considering how huge the film was, you would almost expect it to run months over. And then also the budget ballooned from $120 million to at least $200 million, making it the most expensive film ever made at that point, I believe. And I think the previous record holder was True Lies, and perhaps even before that, Terminator 2. I'm not sure on those two things, but either way, he was making expensive films, and this was one where it just, for it to be as good as it was, it kind of had to go over budget, and he really needed that extra time. And I can imagine it was an incredibly stressful set of conditions to work under with all that money, but also knowing that it's going over budget, it's going over schedule, so there's a lot of things at play that I couldn't imagine having that amount of pressure inside my own head. And Cameron then, when things were kind of struggling with the budget and the schedule, he offered Fox to rescind his director's fee. Don't pay me anything, just as a statement of kind of goodwill. And also he let go of his deal to get a percentage of the grosses in terms of profit the film might make. And Fox were already starting to think that we don't think this film's going to make much of a profit, so they initially didn't bother accepting his offer. But apparently they then did, because he offered it a number of times, just to say, look, I'm not trying to scam you guys, like I really truly believe in this. And, I want to make you understand that. So here's my money back. Just let me make my movie. Let me make my art. Now, I don't know myself, in terms of my own, how would I put it? My own skepticism? Is skepticism or yes, my own skepticism and cynicism. Yeah, I'm skeptical and I'm cynical about this whole story that Cameron didn't get paid for Titanic. When the film came out in '97, he said in interviews, I'm not making a single dollar on this movie. They get all the grosses, the percentages, and the profits, and my director's fee goes to them. Now, I don't know if his writer's fee, isn't something that he got paid for. He was bluntly asked, so you made nothing for those 3 years you worked on the movie? And he's like, no. They own the film, but they don't own the authorship of the film. I own the authorship of the film. And he was asked, well, what do you mean by that? And Cameron's like, well, it depends how much money means to you. He was living comfortably. By his own words, he wasn't wealthy, but living comfortably. And for him, the money wasn't the issue. Now, if that's true, if that is 100% true, I have so much respect for James Cameron, because that is truly an artist making his art for the sake of it. And you can argue against how a film like this that is commercial, and very much a part of the Hollywood system, and it is show business. It is a business at the end of the day. You can argue against how pure the art is in something like that. But I think that it is possible for really great filmmakers and storytellers and performers to make a great piece of art within the studio system. You can do something that kind of appeals to both, or achieves both. It achieves commercial success, but it also achieves a kind of artistic integrity. I think that's possible. I do. And it's surely not without compromises along the way. And probably it's impossible to have a truly full, pure, 100% artistic expression also be a huge commercial, venture. But, for the most part, I think it's more possible than people are willing to admit. But, $200 million for a film, I think it's more than $1 million per minute, which is interesting when you think about the shot in the film that's called the $1 million shot. Well, I guess it's only one shot. That's probably a good point. But, as far as actual kind of, breaking down the budget to every minute of the film, it's pretty much around $1 million, if not just over, for every, because it's 3 hours and I think 10 minutes, 3 hours and 15 minutes, something like that. It's a fairly long film. And when the film was in the editing process and it was it's pretty much done, Fox were very worried about the length. They said to Cameron, we're going to cut an hour out of this movie. And there were things cut. There's a lot of things cut, actually, and there's a lot of deleted scenes I still haven't seen myself, but I've seen the important ones. And there was one of the things that was contested about the film in terms of the historical accuracy was actually the SS Californian, which was a ship that was nearby that perhaps could have saved the crew and the passengers of Titanic more successfully. I don't know the exact kind of estimation on that, but they were closer at least than the other ship. But their radio was off, so they didn't hear it. And Cameron did film a scene with that ship and that kind of that moment, but he decided that it was a more clear through line emotionally for the story in the film to not include that. And I kind of agree with that, And if other people don't feel that way, I completely understand. But I think that by that point you really just want to focus more on those characters and the weight of the tragedy and everything. And it almost feels like it's kind of sticking the knife in and twisting it even more to put the Californian detail in there, even though it is, and I do in my head. I don't say I strive for historical accuracy because I don't make films, but in my head I appreciate the highest level of historical accuracy that's possible, because I enjoy films more when they're based on a true story, when they really get details right. And a lot of the details in the film are right. A lot of them aren't, they had like an etiquette coach, a full-time etiquette coach on the set, kind of helping people with the 1912 slang and, way of acting and holding themselves and everything. But there were still things that slipped through the nets and people criticized, and even down to the star formations in the sky that wouldn't have been like that in 1912 at that point in the Atlantic Ocean. So I think personally you can get too bogged down in those minor details, but so much of it I think really has adhered to the historical truthness, or truth, so I need to add the ness to that word, the historical truth of what happened. But at the same time, it does take liberties, and it does take things in slightly different directions. But I think on the whole, it really is a commendable representation, and if not just the pure scope and scale, and if not the pure scope and scale of the thing, I think really overrides for me, any little minor inconsistencies you might find, because it really conveys the power and the weight and the terrible tragedy of what happened. Like it really it's impactful. I'd forgotten that there was a shot in the film of when they go back and there's all the floating bodies. There's a woman there holding a baby frozen in her arms, and that's a big one. I'd forgotten about that, and it was really impactful and emotional. And one could argue maybe that baby shot was unnecessary, and I certainly wouldn't miss it. But for me, the tragedy feels really, really immediate. And just the way that ship was built on that set, so that when you get to the stage where the ship is slowly sinking, that's the thing about the Titanic, it's like I was looking up these shipwrecks and kind of these simulations of what happened to ships that have sunk in the past, and most of them they're done in like 10 minutes. Like the accident happens, begins to fill with water, the ship turns or it tilts and it just goes under. Done, 10-15 minutes max. Titanic was over 2 hours. I believe it was over 2 hours, or just about 2 hours. almost painfully slow in comparison. And that's because they managed to seal off the doors, but it just wasn't, and they just didn't get there in time. And I think there's only a few sections in the bottom of the ship that, if there was just two more that weren't filled up, they probably would have survived, which is, just awful. But the slowness of it just brings so much dread. Like, the panic isn't quite there in this kind of heightened kind of way where it's like, we got to get off the ship. I mean, that is there, don't get me wrong, and you definitely feel the panic, but the ship hits the iceberg halfway through the movie. We got like an hour at least, if not more, of just the slow process of the sinking and people trying to get off. And yeah, maybe I'm underselling it by saying there's no sense of panic, but there's not as much as you might expect, in other kind of maritime disasters where something happens to a ship and it's like panic, drowned, dead. It's over in a flash. And that's kind of, I think, why Titanic is such a, I don't want to say a popular story, but one that clearly holds on to people's minds. It's a very, again, like Cameron said, it's like a great novel, only it really happened. And you just can't imagine being there, and then just seeing it just slowly disintegrate and fall apart in front of your very eyes. But they had their ship and it's kind of halfway into the water and it's there and you can see it. You can see that it's a full ship and it registers as true. But yeah, with the post-production of the film, Cameron balked at the idea of cutting an hour out of the film. He even said, "You have to fire me. And if you're not going to fire me, you have to kill me." And I think that might be a bit of bravado of Cameron, maybe in retrospect, saying, I told them they'd have to kill me before I would let them wrestle the final cut from my cold, dead hands. I don't know if he was truly that, that bold about it. But then again, it's Cameron, he probably was. There's a number of deleted stuff from the film, the Californian, like I said, but the ending in particular, I will mention, is something that's really interesting because the end of the film, obviously, and I'm assuming you've seen the film at this point if you're watching this far in the video, the elderly Rose takes the heart of the ocean, she drops it into the sea, and it's this beautiful moment of catharsis for her, this releasing of the story and kind of finally moving on. It's a really touching moment, and it's a beautiful and tranquil, meaningful and solitary moment. But originally what they shot was she's about to drop the heart of the ocean in, and Bill Paxton's character, he sees her do this, so he runs over and all the crew run over. They're like, "No, it's the heart of the ocean, this is what we've been looking for our whole careers, like, don't do this." And she's like holding it like, "Oh, and it becomes this kind of, it becomes too much like a movie, if that makes sense. I don't know, it just feels too rote, a little bit cliche, and the film's full of cliches, don't get me wrong, but like it felt a bit too much. And then she basically explains the whole, like, yes, I kept onto it, but I never used it because I didn't want Cal to have any hold over me and his money helping me or anything. And it's like, we kind of understand that, I think. Anyone who can kind of, take 2 seconds to really think about it. The reason she held onto it and never sold it, or, I mean, she could have sold it and given it to her kids or grandchildren, but she didn't, because she didn't want Cal, this guy who'd been such a blight on her life when she was younger, to have influenced her in that way financially, or to have provided for her financially. Once she cut herself free of him and became Rose Dawson, she was done with that. But she still held on to it for some reason, and getting to go back to the Titanic and drop that into the ocean, perhaps where it belongs. I mean, that's a powerful statement. But she explains all that in this alternate ending, and it's just, you don't need the words to explain it. It's all implied, and that quiet moment is just the way it should be. And Bill Paxton just wants to hold it. So he holds it, and then she throws it in, and everyone's pissed off, and then Bill Paxton's just like, and he just starts wildly laughing, and it doesn't. It's a really bad moment from Bill Paxton. And he even said in the audio commentary, like, I don't know if he said in the audio, you might not have said it in the audio commentary, but he said in an interview that, like, he would have taken hard drugs to make that scene work, but it didn't. It just didn't. He felt it. He was glad that it was cut. I'm glad it was cut. A lot was trimmed, but it was still a big 3-hour movie, and that was something that the studio were really worried about. But it turns out they didn't really need to worry about that at all. And throughout the production of the film, the press was rooting for this film to fail. They would have weekly kind of updates on how, there's bad news from the Titanic set in Mexico. Cameron's bitten off more than he can chew. It's going to be a big disaster at the box office. The ship is going to sink. They were really rooting for it to fail, and a lot of egg would be thrown onto those faces, and in due course. And the film was delayed. It was initially meant to come out in July 2nd, 1997, and was pushed to December 19th, 1997. They needed that extra 4 or 5 months to fully finesse the visual effects, and it was built to be a big summer blockbuster. But Cameron's just like, it needs to be perfect, and he reunited with James Horner, who they kind of had that falling out with Aliens, and they let bygones be bygones, and it was the same kind of situation perhaps as Kate Winslet, who said, I'd never work with James Cameron again, and then she ultimately comes back for the Avatar sequels, or at least Avatar 2, and James Horner and Cameron, they reunited for this film, and they continued to collaborate, and he worked on the next film, Avatar, as well. And I think that, I don't know, I think Cameron probably, I don't know the situation between them, but I'm sure that Cameron realized that James Horner is an incredible composer and musician, and would give such weight to this film with his incredible music. And I'm sure that James Horner realized that this is a project I really can't turn down. This is really big, and James Horner was familiar with epics. He just recently worked on Braveheart, and it was really a great match, I think, having James Horner do the music. Now, Cameron was actually listening to Enya while he was writing the script, and so he wanted her to do some vocalization for the soundtrack, but she declined, and he then turned to a Norwegian singer and vocalist called Sissel, and she did the amazing vocal that's just this the haunting kind of vocalization you hear at the very beginning of the film and throughout the film. I can't remember which points it actually appears in, but especially in the opening of the film when the title is revealed across the water and the waves. And it's just, and I've actually seen recently there's like a kind of trend online of people on TikTok, I think, whatever TikTok is, of women kind of singing that opening vocalization in like a stairwell. So the echo is just, and it was almost like spine tingling. It's just such an amazing piece of, so I don't know, is it music? I guess it is. I don't know. It's an incredible piece of something. Like it's art, I guess. I don't know. It's music. It's wonderful. It's just, it really strikes a chord, that kind of, the vocalization, I guess that's the only way to call it, is vocalization. The film premiered on November 1st, 1997, a full month and a half before the wide release in Tokyo, for some reason. I do not know why. And the reaction was tepid. That's what it was described. It wasn't the big buzz. But then there was a few, there was preview screenings, which is where the original ending was changed, and they went back and shot a new ending with Gloria Stewart dropping the Heart of the Ocean in on her own, which is just a perfect ending, and I'm really glad they decided to make that change. And that's one good, outcome of test screenings and test audiences and getting that feedback before the film was released. But then the film came out, and it did well, and the reviews are really good. And people in the industry are watching it and really enjoying it and loving it. And then it just started to steamroll, this film. And it's kind of ironic in that, it's Titanic. It's this huge thing. It's the unsinkable ship. And suddenly Titanic became the Titanic again. This film became an unsinkable film. It made so much money. And it was the kind of the average return rate of a normal movie is maybe 4 or 5% or something like that. And Titanic was 20%. It just kept bringing people in again and again. People wanted to see it and experience it over and over again. And suddenly Fox's worries of a 3-hour movie only being able to be screened 3 times a day and they wouldn't be able to maximize their profit didn't matter at all. And you'd have midnight screenings where people are in there till 3:30 in the morning and selling out and taking family members, taking friends. They want to share this experience with people, this emotional, sweeping epic. And it just became so successful and then completely swept the board at the Oscars, and Cameron gave the speech, "I'm the king of the world," and Titanic firmly landed in the pop culture, zeitgeist. I mean, it just arrived, it landed, and I don't think it will ever leave. I think it's had such a lasting impression. There's so many fans of the film, and it just continues to hold up and continues to bring people back. It's a tragic story. It's this very sad story, but there's this hope injected into it, and this, the character of Rose is really used to make Titanic more of a hopeful experience by the end, and while not discounting the tragedy and the lives that were lost. And Cameron did regret certain choices here and there. There was a particular character on the ship, or a person who was on the ship, I should say, one of the officers. I'm assuming that would be their official title, but he's the one who shoots himself in the film, and there's no evidence that happened, and Cameron regrets kind of giving that part, because he wrote that into the script, that one of the officers would be so overwhelmed with everything that was happening that he would just shoot himself out of the pressure and not wanting to die, in that cold water. And, it's a horrible way to go. And he just felt like that probably would have happened. And, it feels like a true moment, a very horrible but true moment. But Cameron later regrets kind of putting that part of the film, that action, to an actual named historical person who was there at the time. And he felt like he probably just shouldn't have done that, and I would agree with that. So there were a few things, but either way, I think that the film, it just has this lasting appeal that people want to go in and they want to feel the emotion and the release of the sadness, but also the beautiful ending. That it is very cliche at the time, and people would criticize Cameron's screenplay, which is one of the only things that the film didn't win an Oscar for, was the screenplay. It wasn't even nominated, I don't believe. He was criticized for that, and he defended his script and said that he doesn't always think that great scripts need to be filled with this, brilliant, witty, and winning dialogue, but sometimes a real straightforward story that's told well, and really captures something in an audience, is just as valid as a great script. And I would agree with that too. I think that this film is in a way underrated. I don't think it's overrated either, because I think this film should be considered even more of a great film. When you look at, the lists of the greatest films of all time, you don't really see Titanic on that list, even though it has the commercial, bottom line of one of the most successful films of all time. I mean, it instantly, but, it very quickly became the highest grossing movie of all time. If you discount the whole kind of tickets sold thing and adjusted for inflation, going back to Gone with the Wind, it made the most money at the box office, ever. And held that record for 12 years. We'll talk about the next record holder in a few videos' time. But and then also there's the commercial, the commercial and the critical acclaim. The people who thought that it was great, but also the awards that were showered upon this film. It was hugely successful, and I think based on people I know, it's a film people go back to again and again. And me revisiting it now in 2020, it was late 2020 that I went back to it. God, it just holds up, and there was even a part that was like, oh, Titanic is 3 hours, it's great, but it's 3 hours long. And then once I'm there, it clicks at such a fucking pace, those 3 hours. And it's just a phenomenal film. It really is a phenomenal film. In 2017, it was selected for the US National Film Registry for films that are kind of culturally kind of important. And I wouldn't have been surprised if it had gone in sooner even. I think that it is an important American film. It tells a great story of a real, an important story that really happened, but also I think it's one of the great romance films. I think that the chemistry between DiCaprio and Winslet is brilliant, and the overall story is simple, but it's so efficiently told, I think, and just has it packs such a punch for me. See, the thing is, I've always found the ending moving, even as a kid when I first saw this in the cinema. We'll talk more about that in the next video, but just the final scene when she imagines herself in her dreams, or perhaps in the afterlife, that she's gone down into the ship again and everyone's there, and she sees Jack again as he was, and there she is as she was, and they kiss and everyone claps. It asks a lot of you to take that moment seriously, and I assumed as an adult I'd look back on it more cynically, and I didn't. In fact, it almost made me really, tear up and have a little sob. So it just has continued to grow in stature in my mind. It's been even more effective as an adult, and I think that's really the mark of a truly great film. And it won 11 Oscars, and that's a record that I think still stands today. It's tied with two other movies, Ben-Hur and Return of the King, The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, which was maybe 6 years after Titanic, I guess. It would be 2004, so 7 years after Titanic, I think, when Return of the King swept the board. But I don't think that record will ever be topped. I think it's a really tricky one. But this Titanic just had so much that was great about it. It won Cameron Best Director. It won Best Film, Best Art Direction, Cinematography, Editing, Visual Effects, Costume Design, Sound Design, Sound Effects Editing, the score, the original song, Celine Dion. The only things it didn't win were Makeup Kate Winslet for Best Actress, and Gloria Stewart for, I'm assuming, Best Supporting Actress. I really wish Gloria Stewart had won, because the more I watch the film, the more I realize she's the kind of secret weapon of the movie, and she is fucking incredible. She is absolutely mesmerizing in the film, Gloria Stewart. Just fantastic. But yeah, swept the board. And, he's probably not going to watch this, but a good friend of mine, Sean Zaranizarak on YouTube, he's really not a big fan of this film, and he found the Oscars so offensive to him because Cameron said, "I'm the king of the world," when winning, Best Picture. But, I looked into it, and he didn't say that during the Best Picture win. He said that when he won Best Director. And then later on in the night, the film won Best Picture. And the whole ceremony ends with Cameron thanking the Academy and saying, we can now have like a minute silence for the, not even the survivors, but the people who lost their lives on the actual ship. So, just a moment of silence for all the lives that were lost. And that's how the broadcast ends. I think that was a very, delicate, situation. But the right thing to do, and a nice touch, I think. But, Sean couldn't, for the life of him, get over the whole "I'm the king of the world" thing. Now, this series is called Cameron King of the World. Let's end with this. And I use it in the beginning of every video, kind of because I find it funny that it is a little bit of a cringeworthy moment, and I kind of find that amusing. But the sentiment behind it, I think, has been so misconstrued. And Cameron's talked about this himself, but I've always thought this, myself too. At the end of his Best Director speech, he said, "The only thing I can say is I'm the king of the world." And it feels like this guy saying, "I've just won Best Director. Fuck all of you. I am the actual man. Like, swivel." That's not what he meant. What he was doing was quoting the movie. In the movie, when Jack gets up on the front of the ship and he says, "I'm the king of the world," he means I've got nothing but, a few bucks in my pocket. But for this moment, I feel like I'm on top of the world, and it isn't about having any accolades or any awards. It's just this moment. And that's kind of what he was doing. And he said he later regretted it only because by quoting the film in that way, he's assuming that everyone likes the film, which isn't the case. And so this celebratory moment of embracing this film that he's made, and this quote that for him, is more about the idea of just reveling in something personal, as opposed to looking down on anyone or being arrogant or having an ego. It's just more like, at this moment, for me, I feel like I've arrived, and no matter whatever else happens, at this moment in time, I feel like the king of the world. It's not I am the king of the world, it's I feel like the king of the world. And that's an important distinction, I think. But, many people would disagree on that, and many people would still disagree that it was a distasteful thing to do. And that's fair enough. I disagree, but we all have our opinions, and that's fair enough, I suppose. And one last thing, Cameron, continued to state that he made no money from the film. And I just don't know if I really truly believe that. But one interesting nugget is that there was a young boy who appeared in the film. He was with the Irish family, the mother who goes down with the ship with her kids, and the young boy, Rhys Thompson is his name. He had one line in the movie. I think he appears 3 times in the film. He had one line in the film, and he continues to receive royalty checks from the movie. They're very small, incremental, royalty checks, but he's now amassed over $30,000 in royalties, and to him it's just like a part of life now. Oh, hey, $100 from Titanic again, just kind of, water for ducks back, I suppose. But 30 grand as opposed to nothing for the man who spent 3 years making the film is pretty crazy if it's true. But I still think that there was word in 1998, after the big success of the film and everything changed, that Cameron had refused to receive the back end of the kind of profits back from the studio. But that, who do you really trust on that? I don't know. But if that really is true, and I would love, there's no really real way to know, because Cameron will say one thing and I'll believe another, because it just seems so unlikely that a film would make, like $1 billion or however much it made, and that the director and the writer of the film would receive absolutely nothing. I mean, this is a guy who sold half of his ownership of the Terminator story and intellectual property to Gale Ann Hurd for $1, but that was back in the days when he was in a completely different position. So I don't know. Maybe he was paid by Fox for the contract that he had signed to make a certain number of movies, and so you know, he technically got paid, but he didn't get paid to be the director of Titanic, or he didn't get paid to be the writer, or he didn't receive, you know, a section of the profits, but he was paid for, you know, being a Fox employee. I don't know. There must be some loophole where he got paid somewhere, because I find it hard to believe. But regardless, that was James Cameron's journey to raising the Titanic and coming out of it at the end with one of the great epics of Hollywood history, I think. And we'll talk more about it in the next video, where I'll talk to you about my own personal reflections on the film itself, what I think. I mean, I've talked about it a lot in this, and again, I've already made a video that's an hour long talking about you know, reviewing the movie with Connie. So it's a bit different because it's kind of a me and Connie video, but you know, I'm going to retread old stuff, but I'll talk more about the film itself, probably in a much shorter fashion than this video. I apologize for the length, but there was a lot to get through. So I'll leave it there for now. That was Titanic. That was Cameron's kind of big. I mean, you know, that's probably, I think, going to remain the film that I don't know if it is the film he'd be known the most. Probably, yeah, from a general wide audience, I would say, because this film had such universal appeal. You know, I went to see this film with people from an old people's home. So there was me at, like, what age would I have been? And you know, probably would have been early 1998 when I saw the film, so 9 years old. And here I am with people who are 70, 80, 60, you know, and we're all enjoying it and getting different things out of it, but it has this broad appeal. So I think that, you know, older people who enjoy history and have kind of an interest in the story love the film, and they haven't got a clue what the Terminator is, or Aliens, or especially not True Lies, you know, even Avatar. So I think that Titanic will probably be the film that Cameron is the most known for. It depends how the Avatar sequels shake out and how much of an impact on the pop culture, you know, collective the Avatar franchise will have once the sequels start rolling out. But I do think Titanic will ultimately be the film he's always known for the most, and you know, you'll see that kind of from the director of Titanic, you know, and rightfully so, I think. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.